While I was preparing my presentation, I came across a quote by historian David McCullough that sums up my interest in history and, to me, at least, the theme of my talk tonight. And that is, history is who we are and why we are the way we are. And to me, the history of Reading is the history of California Street. It's a perfect microcosm of Reading as it was, as it is, and as it could be again, all on one street. This is California Street. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, a lot like novelist Gertrude Stein once said, there is no there. And you may have a point. So I think it's important to acknowledge a few things tonight, that this right here did not happen by accident. This is the result of people generally acting with the best of intentions. It is the result of both action and inaction. It's said that hindsight is 20/20, and if that's true, then we stand to learn a lot from the past. And there's still a lot of history here on California Street, if you can look below the surface. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the how and why we got to where we are today. Now, a lot of you probably know California Street from the 50s, when it was considered to be Reading's Skid Row, full of flop houses, cheap bars, bowling alleys, and that sort of thing. And that's true, but before that, it was home to the finest hotels, to doctors' offices, drugstores, bookstores, hardware stores, the phone company, the post office, the first farmer's market. It was home to industry like sawmills and foundries and breweries. It was home to some of the wealthiest citizens and to some of the poorest. In short, it was where people of every ethnicity, nationality, and background rubbed shoulders. So with that in mind, let's talk about the modern history of Reading. The town was founded in 1872 by the California and Oregon Railroad. It was laid out in a simple grid, pictured here, of numbered blocks. Most of the blocks had alleys. The original boundaries were West Street, East Street, South Street, and North Street, now known as Eureka Way. And the original area was just a quarter square mile, or 160 acres. In the center, the railroad set aside some land for its use called the Railroad Reservation. It had the passenger and freight depots, and because we were the end of the line for over 10 years, it also had a turntable and a roundhouse. So let's take a closer look at California Street. You can see most of the lots here are quite narrow, just 25 feet wide. That's because back then, taxes were often based on street frontage, so a narrow lot meant lower taxes. Now, let's bring some satellite footage in and get you oriented. Okay, we are here, over on the left. You can see the Lorenz, the next block north here, and the parking structure on these 3 blocks. We're going to be talking a lot about this block tonight. This is the block that the proposed K2 McConnell project would be at. It was originally numbered Block 19, and that's a short and easy way of referring to it, so that's what I'm going to call it. The first lots were sold on August 8th, and most of them were on that block. The first business in California Street was not C.C. Bush's store, but rather it was a boarding house run by a Civil War vet from Michigan named Alfred S. Castle, and it was half on Block 13 and half in the street. Although boarding house might be a stretch, it was just a canvas tent and an outdoor kitchen. Now, this isn't actually it. This is a railroad survey team about 10 years later, further up the canyon. But this is probably what Reading looked like in those very first days. Block 13 was also home to the Bell Rooms today, and it was home to our first firehouse, the Second Star, our first jail, which gave Calaboose Creek its name, and our first public building, a justice court located above the firehouse. C.C. Bush's store, which was the first permanent improvement in Reading, was located on the southeast corner of Butte and California Street. Chinatown formed in this area here, north of Shasta on California and along Shasta. It was probably initially populated by workers laid off by the railroad when they stopped construction here for 10 years. And the first brick building was also built on Block 19 in the summer of 1873, although timber buildings dominated the street for the first decade or two. And our friend Alfred Castle even moved into more permanent quarters. I'm pretty sure this is him, but even if it's not, it's a really great example of a typical wood frame building of that era. Now, a lot of this lumber was probably cut locally. The first sawmill in town was located where Woody's is today, and there was another one just south of where Riverfront is going in on Calaboose Creek, between California Street and the tracks. You can't really talk about Reading without talking about the railroad. It's hard to overstate the importance of the railroad to Reading. It founded the town, and it was the primary way that most people arrived in Reading, and most goods arrived in Reading until at least the 20s and probably later. So California Street very much acted as a gateway to the city, and here you can kind of see the effect. This is our old railroad station. It was torn down in the 90s, and the Raba Transit Center is there now. You can see that the railroad's land between that and California Street is pretty nice there, but it's always been a complicated relationship. Yeah, we wouldn't exist without the railroad, but we had to beg them to let us put Tehama Street through the property, and then we also had to nag them over the years to clean up their property. So let me show you what I mean. This is a photo taken in January of 1887. It shows a balloon ascension near California Street. This was taken near the freight depot, and what we're looking at here, these buildings line California Street. This building right here is John Major's Opera House, and it's facing Tehama Street there on the corner. It also had a livery on the ground floor. This is the first brick building in Reading, 2 stories. And if you notice, the ground down here between the street and the railroad is a bit of a depression. They called this Castle Lake after our friend Alfred Castle, whose saloon was across the street. And it took anywhere between 15 or more years of complaints for the railroad to finally put in drainage and fill it to the street level. Now we're gonna pan right into a slightly newer photo taken about 10 years later. So this is the block between Butte and Yuba, the middle of the parking structure today. Couple things about this. This is the intersection right here of Yuba, and Yuba would be running this way where that ditch is, basically. In the foreground here, that's probably the basement for the Lorenz being constructed. And one of the things you should notice is that the street has a bit of a slope to it that isn't quite as obvious today. You can see there's stairs on the sidewalk and a ramp. So a lot of changes over time. Now let's take a closer look at this building. This was built for the drugstore firm of Gleaves and Averill. They found themselves overextended not long after the building was completed, and it had a bunch of tenants over the years. Right now, it's occupied by the Garrett and Lyon Hardware Company, and the Reading Free Press is on the extreme left there. One of the things I want you to notice is the large arched windows and entryways. This is really characteristic of the architecture on California Street. The Golden Eagle Hotel had this sort of look on its ground floor. The Paragon Hotel up the block had it on the second floor. And then over here on the left, that's the old C.C. Bush building. It was almost identical. I'm not sure which came first. So one of the interesting things about brick construction of this era is that it used a method of construction called party wall or common wall construction. And it has a couple of benefits. Generally, it introduces what they call fine-grained urbanism. And it has a lot of benefits, but the best thing about it is that it's inexpensive. And because what it is the shares a wall to support the roof and floor. So instead of building 4 walls to build a building, you'd only have to build 3, or sometimes, like in this case, just 2. So there's a lot of great things about it. The other buildings acted as insulation, so you had lower heating and cooling costs. And the construction costs, of course, were lower, which allowed ordinary people to be downtown developers. And they could even offset costs further by renting out unused space. So we're looking at Block 19 here. And another nice thing about fine-grained urbanism is that it puts a lot more businesses, a lot more destinations within walking distance because of the narrower lots. By my count, there's 10 different storefronts on this block alone. So one of the problems with that is that due to modern building codes and construction finance, it's really difficult to build this way today. So once it's gone, it's gone. This is another really common material that was used locally, and that's corrugated iron. Right now, we're looking at the back of Block 19 from the alley in probably the 50s. And a lot of these buildings you'll see didn't go all the way back to the alley line. Back then, construction was much more incremental, and so businesses would build extensions as needed. The ones that couldn't afford to build out of brick, after the city was incorporated, everything had to be fireproof. So they'd often build these cheap corrugated iron additions. So it's probably not the most attractive thing used in bulk, but it can still be used well as an accent piece, and I see we even have some in this building right now. So another interesting thing about development during this era is that the corner lots were considered to be the most valuable lots. This is because of the street frontage, and as a result, they would have the biggest, grandest, or most important buildings, whereas today, more often than not, you'll see a gas station on a corner. So in Reading, we had the Lorenz, the Golden Eagle Hotel, and the Hill Building all on the corner, and they were quite significant structures. In the days before air conditioning, we're going to take a slow walk down California Street. California Street is right here. We're starting at Tehama. You'll see Market Street buildings in the background. In the days before air conditioning, almost every building in Reading had either an arcade, a covered sidewalk, a porch, or an awning of some sort. And this had a couple of things. First, it shaded people from the sun or the rain, which obviously in Reading is really important. Secondly, it shaded the building from the sun, which meant that it kind of acted as a buffer against the summer days because it wasn't getting direct exposure. And finally, it also provided additional living space because some of the fancier buildings had balconies on the second or third floor where people could go out and then enjoy the fine evening air. So why did all of these go away? Well, modernism was exploding in the 1920s. New construction styles meant that old ways were becoming obsolete, and so it became very much out of fashion to have excessive ornamentation. And a lot of other towns in the valley were removing their structures. So there was one event more than any that really sealed the deal for Reading, and that was a fire on Butte Street. According to the editor of the newspaper, the awnings acted as a flume and made the fire much worse than it needed to be, and the awnings were eventually condemned and came down not long afterwards. So it's kind of interesting to me because the buildings reflected our local environment and our local culture. They were made out of local brick from some very large clay deposits south of the city, and they had awnings that were designed to mitigate the extreme weather. So there's always kind of been a relationship like that. Churchill said that we shape our buildings, and then after our buildings shape us. And I really can't think of a better example of that than a place of worship. Some of you may recognize this. This is currently the oldest church in Reading. It's located on the corner of California and Trinity Street. A lot of people probably know it as the Four Square Church, but when it was originally built, it was known as the AME Zion Church, and it was built by a community of people that have been largely neglected by written history. A lot of people don't realize that Reading once had a tremendous African American population. So they had their own church, their own political club, their own baseball team, their own lodge of Freemasons, and more. According to the 1900 census, they were the second largest ethnic group, numbering over 120 individuals and representing 4% of the population, which is 3.5 times larger than the current percentage. A lot of the African Americans were stuck in the type of jobs that you would expect: a porter, a waiter, a boot black, that type of thing. But there was one man in particular that was able to rise above his station, and that is James Henry Coleman, pictured here standing on the left. Coleman settled in Reading about 1887, and he was known as a master carpenter. He built a number of buildings in Reading and the outlying area. He was also an active member of the AME Zion Church, and we suspect that he may have built the church as well. But we haven't been able to confirm that yet. By 1901, he co-owned a brickyard south of town where Wyndham Lane is today. And we haven't quite figured out why the African American population dropped so dramatically, but we do know that it happened between the 1910 and the 1920 census. So hopefully more research will shed light on that. Another community that had a number of pioneers is the Jewish community. You probably recognize this name if you've ever been south of town, Breslauer. Daniel Breslauer arrived in Reading in November of 1872 and opened a dry goods store. And just a few months after the town was founded, and he ended up owning considerable land in the area and founded one of our first subdivisions on what is now West, Chestnut, Willis, and Magnolia Streets, the Breslauer edition. His clothing store, he eventually moved over to Market Street and started a clothing store known as The Hub, and it was run by the family until the 1940s, and it closed sometime in the 60s or the 70s. Another community that was quite large in the Reading area was the Italian American community. They had saloons, hotels, restaurants, a couple macaroni factories, is what they called them, and there was even an Italian language newspaper in Reading for a while. Right now we're looking at Marco Doda's Reading Hotel, and this was located on the corner of Shasta and California, just east of where the Bell Rooms is today, at that little parking area. So his family operated this until the 1940s, and it was sold, and it became what's known as a labor temple, and it was a home to basically every union in town until that too was torn down in the 1960s. So at roughly 50% of the population at any given point, probably the most neglected part of Reading history is women's history. Now, this is probably one of the more famous women in Reading. This is Susan Lorenz, who parlayed her family's gold wealth into one of Reading's finest hotels, the Lorenz Hotel, which we still have today. There's also Jane Olney. After her husband passed away, she took over the Olney Saloon. Presumably, they owned property down near the creek, but I haven't confirmed that yet. And she parlayed it into her own theater empire. She owned 2 different theaters in town. And then another famous woman on California Street was Sarah Hill, but she's so underrepresented that I was not able to locate a photo of her. But after her husband passed away, she tore down his old hotel and built the Hill building, pictured here, which had the post office for a number of years. So this is the hotel that she tore down. It was called the Alta House, and it was home to another chapter of Reading history that's kind of neglected, and that's of the labor movement and the social movement. Reading had its own chapter of the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, and they met there at the Alta House. Reading also had a large socialist party at the time. 1 out of every 10 voters was registered to the Socialist Party. They regularly fielded candidates for the county office, and one of them even had a regular column in the Searchlight. So this is Harry Hill, seated. He's an interesting guy. He was one of the wealthiest citizens in Reading. He had his own subdivision north on California Street too, and a house that's still standing there today. You might be able to see he had a disability. He lost his leg when he was just 10 years old. So maybe it made him a little more sympathetic to people that were disadvantaged. He was also partners with James Coleman in the Brickyard. So interesting guy. Now we're inside the Alta House Saloon. This is Harry standing here, kind of hiding his leg. Reading was always a bit of a drinking town, but once the copper industry really took off, the drinking took off to match. By, by 1904, there were close to 30 saloons in town, and Block 19, every storefront except for one was a saloon. Yeah, and the other one was a barber, so. One of the neat things about saloons before Prohibition is they were kind of the original third place. Not only could you get a drink there, but you could get a bite to eat, sometimes even a free lunch. You could find work there. They often had employment services there. If you were a new immigrant and it was run by a fellow countryman, you could get language translated there. You could cash your paychecks there. You could borrow money there. And of course, sometimes you could find female companionship there too. Of course, sometimes, like it does today, drink can lead to trouble. And it happened one summer night in 1916. Now, don't let this headline fool you. There was nothing near about the riot. Let me set the scene. This was the time during Pancho Villa's insurgency. And so there were a lot of border raids going on, both by the Americans and the Mexicans. Raids, retaliations. And the president had just called for state militias to help serve at the border. Well, a lot of people don't know that there were a lot of Mexican people working on the Acid Canal when it was under construction. And they had a camp down in Olney Creek. So one night, they decided to come up to Reading and California Street and have a beer. And tensions were kind of high, and one thing led to another, and it turned into an hour-and-a-half street brawl in front of Block 19. And people came and went. Somehow, there wasn't any gunplay. There was fist fights, knives. According to the paper, the Americans were the ones that started it. And so it was just kind of shrugged off, and then it happened again a week later. And this time, they decided they had to do something, so the saloons were forbidden to sell beer to Mexicans. Nevertheless, there was a lot of cultural exchange happening all the time. Rachel once asked me about the history of food culture, and I came across a display ad that kind of summed it up nicely. A mighty fine combination these cool nights. So this was in 1904. So I started seeing a bunch of tamale ads, and I got curious, what's the deal? Well, tamales go back to 8000 BC in Mesoamerica, but they made their modern debut in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, and they were in Reading no later than 1899. And judging by the number of ads, they were quite popular. I'm guessing it was kind of like the original convenience food. So you can still pick them up, of course, at the farmer's market today. So that's a nice bit of continuity. But that wasn't the only food culture happening in Reading. Oysters, interestingly enough, have been a Shasta County favorite going back to the 1850s. I kind of shuddered to think how they got up here, but there you go. Of course, ice cream, because of our summers, was a tremendous favorite too. The Sugary here, located next to the Reading Theater, made their own candy and ice cream and did quite well for a number of years. Reading also had a large German population. They were generally the largest ethnic group or national origin in America, so it's no surprise. And this delicatessen or sausage factory was located just catty-corner from us on Placer in California. Had a number of cheeses that I still can't pronounce today. One of the first restaurants after the Chinese came back to Reading was a Chinese restaurant, and this would have been in the 20s. And Freddy's was an early Italian restaurant active in the 40s, where Theory Collaborative is now at the North End. And of course, Reading's most iconic restaurant is exactly where it opened across the street in 1938. Nowadays, a lot of us ride our bicycles to burn off the beer and tamales, but back then, riding was a bit more utilitarian. people of all different careers used the bike as part of their duties, whether it was law enforcement or technicians like this telephone lineman pictured here. And it's no surprise, really, because bicycling, a leisurely pedal is like 3 times faster than walking. And the great thing about bicycles is you don't have to feed them, you don't have to saddle them, and you don't have to store them. So it was adopted pretty quickly. We had a bicycling club here in 1889 with 5 members, but by 5 years later, it had over 100 members. So hopefully you're getting a sense that California Street and Redding in general were much more diverse than you may have previously thought. And California Street was certainly a vibrant place, as you can see here. So the question is, what happened to all of this vibrancy? Well, to put a fine point on it, it was the car. The first car arrived in Shasta County in 1901, but it was anything but a runaway success. A newspaper article in 1910 said that there were 40 cars in town, and most of them had only been purchased in the past 6 months. But I've found complaints about downtown parking as early as 1923. So this was at a time when Redding looked like this. So there was a little bit that extended beyond to the south here, but for the most part, this was it. There was nothing across the river. In 1923, we would have had Market Street acting as the Pacific Highway, which was a forerunner of Highway 99. And the only off-street parking that was provided back then would have been in commercial garages, which kind of developed from the stable model. It was the same kind of principle. So people were used to paying to park their horse and carriage, and it was a natural thing to extend that to cars. Beginning in the 20s and then extending through the 30s, these residential neighborhoods south of the business core and east on Pine Street gradually converted to auto-based businesses, whether it was service stations or more motels or that sort of thing. So Redding did most of its growth during the era of auto-based development. You can see here in 1950 and then how we got up to 2010. So as a result, most of the growth is sprawling. We went from our original area of a 1/4 square mile to an area of over 60 square miles today. And the problem with this kind of development is that it really can't pay for itself. It doesn't earn enough to pay the cost to put in the infrastructure. So the parking meter was invented in 1935 in Oklahoma. It was designed to encourage parking turnover, and it came to Redding about 12 years later. Here, we were pictured Paul Bodenhammer with the parking meter. He was a fierce opponent of paying for parking, and he spent a number of weeks trying to instigate a taxpayer revolt, but ultimately nobody really cared. And eventually he came around and said, yeah, these are really effective at encouraging parking turnover. And so this arrangement kind of lasted for a while, but merchants were still clamoring for a larger parking supply. So Redding decided to get into the parking lot business. So in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, they acquired Block 19 and tore that down for commercial parking. Around 1965, the next block south was torn down over property owner protest and converted to surface parking as well. And the next block, which had the Golden Eagle, it lost that in a fire and it was converted to parking at some point, and we had these surface lots where the parking structure is for a time of about 10 years. When the city got redevelopment money as part of the downtown mall project, which resulted in the loss of another 2 to 3 dozen historic buildings, they built the parking structure pictured under construction here. And they issued lease revenue bonds to pay for its construction. It was assumed that the revenues from the improvements would cover the payments on the bond, but they did not. And as of 2003, it was reported that $1.5 million was still owed. So that kind of brings us up to 2018, where we are today, with the implicit question in my mind, what comes next? And that concludes my presentation.